Hey guys, Tony Rowe here. Switching it to you a little bit today. We're gonna do an OTB review. So, despite popular beliefs and opinions, I do occasionally play over the board chess, and it's no secret that one of the best ways to improve is to analyze your OTB games. So, I've already analyzed this game. I've taken a look at it by myself, with friends, with really my opponent after the game a bit, anywhere I can. And I'm the type of person that needs to review things really in some kind of a spaced interval fashion for me to remember it. And so I'm taking a look at all of my analysis again, and I figured why not do it on stream so maybe all of you guys can get something out of it as well. So here I am. I'm just going to kind of wing it, see where we get to. So just some background. First of all, this was played at a time control of game 30, so both players had 30 minutes with a 5-second delay. And I think most of my viewers are from the United States, but I don't know how regional the preference for delay is. So in Cleveland and in Ohio, generally, people prefer delay to increment in a lot of time controls, especially the rapid time controls. Let's say game 60, game 45, game 90, etc. So instead of getting an increment where you get 5 seconds added to your clock every move, your clock doesn't start for 5 seconds after your opponent hits his clock. So you have 5 seconds to make a move before your time starts counting down. And my opponent is Jonas Reed. He's around 2100, I believe, and this was in the last round. The previous round, bungled a completely winning endgame against a national master, and I was, excuse my French, pretty good and pissed off at this point. It hadn't been that great of a tournament for me, and luckily I redeemed myself. So let's, without further ado, get to the game. So I'm white, and by now I sort of habitually play one knight f3. So after one knight f3, my opponent went knight f6. I went g3 as usual. Of course, there are other moves. c4 and d4 are possible. d4, of course, would transpose to normal stuff. And c4, it's possible to transpose to normal 1d4 openings as well. I'm going to try not to go into an excessive amount of opening theory here. I will add some supplemental games, I think, in the description that I think are theoretically relevant and just instructive on their own. So my opponent went 2d5. Not a super common move order. Usually if people go one knight f6, they're usually planning to either go g6 and go for a Grunfeld or King's Indian defense type setup, or they're intending to go b6 or c5 and go into a symmetrical English or sometimes a hedgehog type structure. So the d5 is already mildly surprising, but of course it's a completely classical and playable move. Bishop g2, and now the most popular move here is c6, which is what my opponent played, going into kind of a Slavish, Anglo-Slav setup. And I almost always play c4 here, though I will note that I'm getting a little lazy in my old age, and it is possible to castle, eliminating my opponent's next option, which happened in the game. And usually it also stays a little bit more flexible with white's central pawns. d3 and e4 is possible. c4 is possible on the next move, or b3, bishop b2, c4, or just d3 and c4, which is the most common. But this is a move order that I might look into a little bit in the future, just for future reference. But I played c4, and my opponent played the most popular move here, in the databases at least. In my practice, this move is not the most popular move. He played d takes c4. It is worth noting that there are a lot of other moves that are possible here. Bishop f5 and bishop g4 are both extremely popular in all of the Slavish setups where white delays e6. It makes logical sense to play your bishop outside of the pawn chain before playing e6. So bishop f5 and bishop g4 are both extremely popular. And there's g6 right away. And there's e6 entering some kind of a English versus semi-Slav sort of hybrid. All of those moves are fine, but my opponent plays d takes c4, which is the most ambitious move, I think, and the most popular. And I just castle. Usually white well, I shouldn't say that. I was about to say usually white wins the pawn back. In a lot of lines, white wins the pawn back. In some, black can try and be obstinate and keep it. But in any case, it's fine to castle first for white before you start looking to grab the c4 pawn back, just to give black one more move to kind of declare himself. It's hard for him to avoid doing something committal here, which gives white a little bit more information. For instance, e6 blocks in the bishop. If he moves the light square bishop, he declares where it's going to go. Something like b5 does indeed protect the pawn, but it exposes some weaknesses and gives white some targets on the queen side. For instance, with a4 or b3, etc. It weakens the long diagonal. So white waits a second before committing the rest of his forces. And my opponent went g6. And this move isn't the main move, but it's not a bad move, and I've seen this move probably more frequently than I'd normally see it because it's a move that John Bartholomew plays. So we've had a couple bullet games on Lee Chess and also a 15-minute game on ICC on his channel that was recorded. I may or may not link to that game. I probably will. I lost that game, but my position out of the opening was okay. Of course, a very natural idea. Black just wants to go bishop g7, castles, and usually black is going to not hang on to this pawn. I don't think playing g6, bishop g7 is very harmonious with the plan of trying to keep the pawn. It's a little slow if you're trying to keep the pawn, first of all, and yeah, it's not really in line with plans that involve b5 or bishop e6, etc. So usually white can count on winning the pawn back now. It's a little bit more critical for black to play, instead of g6 here, to play knight b to d7. Whoops. Intending to go knight b6 and protect the pawn. And the usual line there is queen c2, knight b6, and now I like knight a3. It is possible for white to go a4 first and hit the knight, and after a5, only then go a3. But after a4, a5, knight a3, somehow I feel like, because this pawn is on c6, that black benefits a little bit more from the insertion of a4 and a5, because this square is kind of weak, but this square is really not weak, so worth considering, though b6 is a little bit more loose now, so interesting idea nonetheless, but I think theoretically more critical, at least nowadays, is knight a3 immediately. And black has two options. There's queen d5 here, but the main move is bishop e6, and now there are tons of ideas. The main move that I like is b3, and after c takes b3, a takes b3. Because black has put this bishop on e6, he usually goes g6. And after knight c4, bishop g7, knight a5, hitting b7. White has adequate compensation for the pawn. So white has queenside pressure from this knight, down the a file, down the long diagonal, two center pawns to black's one, the potential to get those rolling, and after bishop b2, white has very smooth, clean development. And this is a game which I'll link to in the description. Bartholomew Kojima, I think from London 2012, 2013, something like that. I'll link to the game. An interesting game, John Wynn, and those fans of the Finns YouTube channel might appreciate an over-the-board game from John too. So, but there's also obvious ideas built around harassing this bishop. So, for instance, bishop g5. But the downside to bishop g5 is that after bishop g4, e2 is loose. I'll leave it at that. And one funny thing that's possible in this line also is knight e5, attacking c4 for the third time and threatening to win it back. Now, for a second, it looks like after queen d4, black is both hitting the knight and protecting the pawn, but white has knight takes c6 check. Or knight takes c6, b takes c6, bishop takes c6 check, which is just a total mess after something like king d8, knight b5, queen c5, bishop takes a8. Quite a few games from high-level players here, like Gregory Kaidanov, but I'll leave it at that. It's kind of a mess, and I don't know what the theoretical status of that is, but Okay, that's just a brief overview of knight d7. But in the game, black played g6, and I played queen c2 here. If I had it to do over again, I might play knight a3 instead. And after bishop g7, knight takes c4, castles, I might go d3, intending something like knight b to d7, bishop d2, knight d5, queen c2, with just kind of a very typical English position, I was about to say English-ish position, where white wants to go, let's say, rook a to b1 to get off the long diagonal, and then b4, b5. So white has this open c file and also the possibility of this typical minority attack against this hook on c6. And white will try and open up lines on the queen side, open up the long diagonal, and black has to try and unravel his pieces a little bit and possibly play in the center with something like e5, f5. But there were a couple really nice games by Roman Djindjiashvili from this position or similar positions around here that he played in the late 70s. 2 games all linked to that are really, really nice and instructive. He absolutely just crushes high-level grandmasters and made me think that maybe it's a little bit more precise to draw out the knight from a3 to c4 instead of the queen from c2 to c4. Worth considering. Okay, so queen c2, bishop g7, queen takes c4, all obvious moves. Bishop e6, queen c2, of course. I need to move my queen. Queen a4 just seems a little bit less logical of a square to me, but is also possible. Queen c2, and now my opponent plays a move that I think is a little bit dubious. Not bad, but maybe slightly imprecise. He goes queen c8. Of course, anyone who's been playing chess much at all will know that the intent is to go bishop h3 and trade off the light squared bishops. But the problem is that queen c8, bishop h3, bishop takes g2 takes 3 moves, and really this bishop at the moment is not a particularly overwhelming piece with the pawn chain on b7 and c6. So I'm a little bit dubious on this, and in general I don't think the queen is like perfectly placed on c8. It's not bad on c8. It allows rook d8, for instance, but yeah, there's something about this move that smells a little bit fishy to me. And so I just continue in normal fashion with knight c3, castles, and now I decide to grab the central space with d4. I could play something like rook e1, for instance, or rook d1 is maybe a little bit more logical, intending to meet bishop h3 by... Whoop, lead chess is reconnecting. Having some connection issues, of course, right when I try and record. Okay, and we're back. Oh, no, we're not. Psych. Rook d1, bishop h3. Okay, and then go bishop h1. But again, I sort of feel like I at the time I felt like it was a more logical exploitation of my opponent's slow plan with these types of moves to simply develop as fast as I could and grab as much of the center as I could right away, and let him exchange off the bishops, as my bishop on g2 isn't particularly great. And usually this plan of exchanging the light squared bishops is a little bit more powerful when your opponent has hopes of launching some attack on the king side. But with this bishop on g7 and with these pieces kind of languishing, my opponent is really only attacking with really 0 pieces. So even if he manages to trade off my light squared bishops, my king will feel incredibly safe. So wasn't too worried about it, was happy to grab the central space. And so we reach kind of this position, and maybe this is the first time where I'll stop and ask you what you would play in this position. So take a second, and if you want to approximate some kind of an OTB experience, take out a clock and give yourself, I don't know, this was a game 30, so give yourself something like 3 minutes and decide what you'd play. There's no right answer, just I think it's a good time to, because there are quite a few options here for white, just take a moment and analyze, and we'll see what you come up with compared to what I came up with. Okay, so I played rook d1, and I like rook d1 the best. The main candidate moves for me, at least, are rook d1 and bishop f4. Bishop e3 is also possible, but I think it's, in this specific case, d4 is not in great need of overprotection, especially if a rook is coming to d1. And it's a little bit less active and also a little bit loose to knight g4. So for me, only really bishop f4 and rook d1 are candidate moves. I guess you could consider something like h3 if you really wanted to put your bishop on e3, but again, I'm not sure that's the best square for the piece anyway. So the thing that I was worried about with bishop f4 is that hopefully during your analysis you keyed in on the fact that black wants to go c5 at some point. So white has this big center, and if black does nothing, white will simply put his pieces on incredibly comfortable squares, maybe with a3, and just have a space advantage, more active pieces, and we'll eventually be able to build up pressure, maybe with something like a3, b4, b5, or organize d5 or e5 at some point, and achieve an overwhelming position. And additionally, it's hard to make sense out of this knight on a6 and this queen on c8 if you're not going to go c5 and meet d5 with something like e6, chipping away at this large center. So the point is that white's center really cannot be allowed to stand. And one of the things I did not like about bishop f4 was that after c5, d5, or c5, d takes c5, knight takes c5, e5, which was one of my principal lines, black can go knight e6. And excuse me, I'm choking for a second. I'm going to pause the video. Give me 1 second. Okay, guys, sorry. I'm back and alive. Yes, after, so let me just review because I totally bungled that. After c5, I was unsure first of all about the evaluation of something like d5, e6, and let's say rook a to d1. Probably white is slightly better, but after something like knight b4, I thought it was pretty messy. And I was also unsure about d takes c5, knight takes c5, e5, which at first looked quite promising after knight e6. And the point being that after e takes f6, knight takes f4 check, white is in some trouble after g takes f4, queen g4 check, king h1, queen takes f3 check, etc., which would be kind of a disaster. So I was a little bit less sure of putting this bishop on this square where it's a little bit loose to either knight c5 to e6 or knight c7 to e6. And so I decided to go with rook d1. And again, maybe at some point it becomes clear that I'd rather have my bishop on e3, though I doubt it, or g5. And so I'm a little bit more sure that this rook wants to be on d1 than I am that this bishop wants to be on, let's say, f4, for instance. So in general, it's better to put your pieces, I think, on squares where you know they're going to go, and then save the pieces that you're unsure about for a little bit later, if you can do so. That's not a hard and fast rule, but I think it's a good idea to stay flexible in the opening phase if you can. So I played rook d1, and my opponent played e6, which I think is a mistake, a positional mistake. It's not necessarily a tactical mistake, but it's a mistake nonetheless. And before we go into e6, I think it's worth looking at maybe the justification of this rook d1 idea. So now that the bishop is not on f4 and it's not possible to go knight c5 to e6, something like c5, d5 is of course playable, and I think not bad. You would have to worry about c4 and knight c5 to d3, for instance, but this is probably playable for white. But after d takes c5, my idea was knight takes c5, e5 now, and knight e6 does nothing, of course. So black has to move the knight, and now knight d5 is annoying. And I think white is just a little bit better here, at least. Something like rook e8, bishop g5, for instance, with rook a to c1, etc. So this would be quite a bit more comfortable for white. And so rook d1, in a way, is a little bit of prophylaxis and preparation for c5. I know that black's only real bid for counterplay in this position because e5 is hard to achieve for him. Whoops. is c5, and rook d1 prepares me a little bit better for the opening of the d file, for instance. So, okay, but anyway, black goes e6, perhaps intending to go c5 when d5 doesn't really give me the chance to go d6. If maybe my opponent was scared of something like c5, d5, e6, d6, and so he reasons that he wants to go e6 right away and plan on c5 next move, meeting d5 with e takes d5, e takes d5, and whatever. But the problem with playing e6, and the problem with playing e6 in all of these positions where you go bishop g6 and bishop g7, is that once you put this pawn on e6 and this pawn on g6, you start to, especially with this pawn on c6, actually, these three in a row, you start to have problems on the dark squares. So these squares start to look a little bit more weak once you play e6. With the pawn on e7, f6 is protected twice, and you don't have a hole on d6, but immediately you can see the difference right away. I mean, black's position looks quite a bit more gross, in my opinion. So I think this is a positional error, and I think it's also a good opportunity for you guys to take a second and think about what you'd do here. So pause your video. Again, if you want, give yourself 4 or 5 minutes. Think about what you'd play. Okay, so perhaps this is an obvious move for some of you guys. I played e5, and right away, of course, I'm just gaining more central space, but also I'm focusing on these two weaknesses and getting ready to place even more pressure on these two weaknesses by vacating the e4 square for this knight. And all of a sudden, knight d6, knight e4 to d6, hitting the queen, hitting b7, is starting to look kind of terrifying. And there's also stuff like knight e4, bishop g5, and then planting something on the f6 square, either the knight or the bishop. So things are starting to look a little bit scary. And here my opponent played another move that I think is a little bit, well, not a little bit, quite bad, and shocked me a little bit for a 2100 player to play this move. He goes knight g4. I think knight d5 is pretty much the only move. Maybe knight fd7 is possible, but it looks really passive and bad. I mean, knight d5 just seems like the obvious move, right? The only real downside to white's playing e5 is the fact that it gives the knight this juicy square on d5. Of course, I would play knight e4, and I think white is better. I mean, knight d6 and the f6 square is still a little bit loose, but at least black has this powerful knight well centralized, guarding the f6 square, guarding e7, etc. In the game, black's knight gets really very poorly misplaced. Now, I did miss something here in this position. I assumed that this was still quite a bit better for white, but Stockfish points out that there's this silly idea of c5 immediately, which, of course, I think any normal human player would just give up on this, would not even consider this move because it just hangs a pawn. I mean, there are 3 white attackers, 2 black defenders, but after d takes c5, black has b6, exploiting the pin along the c-file. And also after c6, there's knight a to b4 with a double attack on c2 and c6. So typical computer-ish counterplay that no human would ever find, but an interesting line nonetheless. And a reminder to always look at forcing type sequences and tactical shots like this. Okay, but I played e5, and at this moment I had about half my time left. So in my notes I have that I have 16 minutes left, just for the record. My opponent plays knight g4, and without thinking much, I played h3, and my opponent is now, because none of these squares are possible, is forced to go to this poor h6 square. And things wouldn't be really all that bad for my opponent if he had a couple moves to centralize his pieces and get his central counterplay going. For instance, if black were allowed to go knight f5 and c5, maybe he wouldn't be that much worse. But it's a bad sign that already, at least for me, I'm thinking, okay, black would really like to go knight f5, e7 to d5 when he could have already had his knight on the d5 square. So that's a little troubling. And I think this is actually the critical moment of the game. And I'm quite happy with the move I found here, but there's more than one strong move. So again, I would say take 3, 4, 5 minutes. approximate whatever time control you kind of like to play OTB and think about what you'd play here. Okay. I played the move bishop g5. And I think this is exclam worthy. And in my notes, I have it as an exclam. I purposely am not showing the notation so I can make quizzes out of this game. But for the record, there is a study in my YouTube or in my Lee Chess profile that you can check out. It's called OTB Games. It has both the game that I bungled against the National Master in the previous round and this game with a slightly abridged version of my annotations. My annotations in my chess-based file are a little bit more extensive, but for the sake of keeping this video brief and intelligible, I cut it down, and you guys have access to that analysis as well if you want to check it out. Or download the game if you'd like to download my games for some weird reason. I don't know why you would, but if you do, you can do that as well. Okay, so I played bishop g5, and if you have any experience in chess playing against one of these offside knights where your opponent has played g6, bishop g7, and has a knight on h6, you'll know that it's a little bit vulnerable to being trapped because it can't go to f7, can't go to g4, can't go to g8. Its only escape square is f5. But in this specific case, knight f5 is not possible because of g4, which, because the bishop is specifically on g5, it guards the e7 square. And of course, these squares are not possible. Whoops, that's not a square. There we go. And at the moment, if it was white's move, queen d2 or queen c1 would double attack this knight and essentially win it because knight f5, g4 would trap the knight. So black is facing down the threat of queen d2, knight f5, g4, and has to find a reaction to it. And it's already not easy to find a reaction to it. In fact, when I turn on Stockfish just now, it gives plus 1.6, 7, and if I let it think longer, it would probably go even higher. So my opponent, just for the sake of brevity, my opponent played knight c7. Perhaps, of course, just really looking to go knight d5, I presume. And I had about 11 minutes, I think, when I played bishop g5, and I invested about 5 more minutes here, and I would say I essentially calculated to the end of the game. So, as a spoiler, this is white's 17th move, white to play, and I calculated to around, I would say, move 25 or 26. So take a second, more than a second, take maybe 300 seconds, 400 seconds, and think about what you would play here. And if the first move is obvious based on what I already said, maybe it is, maybe I played something else, then calculate as far as you can into the sequence and see how far you can get. Okay, so I played queen d2, and basically forces knight f5, or else black loses a piece immediately. And I, of course, went g4, as already stated. And because the knight has no squares and there's no real other option, black is pretty much forced to play h6 and attack the bishop. And the point, of course, is that any bishop move gets black out of the problems. Bishop h4 will be met by knight takes h4. Bishop f6, probably bishop takes f6, e takes f6. That looks dicey, but maybe it's possible. I'm thinking bishop f6, bishop takes, e takes, and then knight d6, but maybe queen takes h6, and yeah, knight e8, knight g5, or something like that. So, but black is essentially forced to play h6 just to try and budge the bishop from attacking the e7 square. So black would have knight e7 as a retreat, but white doesn't have to move the bishop and can instead embark on many more forcing moves here. After g takes f5, black is forced to take on g5, or else he's just down a piece, and then f6. It is possible to go bishop h8. Of course, it's totally gross. And after something like queen g5, black will be hard-pressed to prevent just an obvious mate after queen h6, knight g5, queen h7 mate. I'm not actually sure there's even a way to stop it. I wonder if I turn on Stockfish if it'll pronounce mate. +6 is as high as I can get it to go. Okay. But my opponent plays the far more obvious move, bishop h6, protecting the pawn, sort of. And here's the key move. So if you reach this position and you already had a move, just continue playing. But if you didn't, take a second and calculate from here and see what you come up with. Okay. So here's the key move that I had to see as far back as move 17 to really make this position work, and that's h4. And yeah, I mean, it looks kind of obvious. Maybe it's obvious, just exploiting the pin on this bishop. Of course, if black does nothing, let's say knight d5, I'm just going to play h takes, and I win a bishop. His bishop has no moves. And something like rook f d8, h takes g5, bishop f8. Of course, rook d8, making room for bishop f8. I don't know. Something like rook h1 is just going to win. Oh, I already had that in the notes. That's funny. Yeah, and queen f4 and queen h1, or some version of some mate on h8 or h7 is going to happen almost assuredly. So this is also completely unplayable. And in fact, my opponent really only has one move to try and maintain the material balance, and that's g4. So again, I had to see that there's this discovered attack on my queen from the bishop, and also g takes f3, which comes with check. And so I have no choice but to play queen takes h6, threatening mate, on g7, g takes f3 check, and here I played, I mean, probably almost any king move is possible, but I decided to play king g3. There is one subtlety that I had to see during the game. I'm not sure it's a huge deal, but it does allow black to survive a little bit longer. Taking on f3 is probably a slight mistake, because after knight e8, of course, guarding against the mate, knight e4, threatening knight g5 and queen h7 mate, or knight d6, attacking the queen and deflecting the knight away from the g7 square. There's queen d8, and on knight g5, there's knight takes f6, stopping the mate for a second, and then queen takes f6 comes with check, and then queen g7 defends. Of course, white is still winning here. White is up a piece, but this complicates matters significantly compared to the game. So you don't give black this knight e8 takes f6, queen f6 check thing by just putting your king on some random square. I played king g3 because I have a sense of humor about these things, and I thought marching my king up as far as I could go was funny, but of course something like king h2 or king h1 or king g1 is probably also good. Okay, so black is forced to go knight e8, and further into the combination, knight e4 is pretty obvious. We've already seen the idea of knight e4 to g5, queen h7, and knight e4 to d6, hitting the queen and deflecting the knight away from the g7 square. So that's the major threat here. And so I saw all this, queen d7 here, and yeah, this was about as far as I looked, and I didn't see any defense for black. My king is ironically nestled very safely on a dark square, in my shredded king side that black's queen can't really reach. And after knight takes f6, e takes f6, queen d6, I played king g4 again, just because I can. I could also play queen h3, king h3, or probably even king takes f3 at this point is good enough to win. But I played king g4 because there are no checks, and either this one or this one is winning on the next move. So my opponent allowed me to mate him with queen d5, queen g7, and that was the end of the game. I hope you guys enjoyed this game. What are the supreme takeaways from this game? I think one is being a little bit flexible in the opening. I think we had this moment after knight a6 where white has a lot of moves, and I was able to settle on rook d1. Not only because for concrete reasons I thought bishop f4 was a little bit worse, but because rook d1 is a little bit more flexible. I'm fairly certain I want my rooks on d1 and c1 in this position, but I'm not sure where I want my bishop along this diagonal, or even on b2, although that looks kind of dumb. So staying flexible is another thing. I think it's worth taking away that at least you need to be a little bit careful in the opening to not be super ponderous. I mean, this queen c8 and then bishop h3, bishop takes g2 idea. I mean, when you think about this position again, I was able to go knight c3, d4, e4, and I get my king to g2, and really all black got was castles and an exchange of light squared bishops. So I gained a lot of time in doing this, and already I think, especially after knight a6, rook d1, black is at a pretty significant disadvantage here. You know, I have the center pawns. I think this knight on a6 is not terrible, but kind of weird. I think black is a little bit, his coordination is a little off, and he has limited counterplay against the center, and I think that's kind of a direct result of being a little bit too ponderous in the opening with this queen c8 and bishop h3 idea. You know, knight on the rim is dim. It's also worth stating, I didn't say this, I played bishop g5 here. It's also worth just playing the more positional g4, really hammering in the fact that this knight is just absolutely terrible on h6, taking away the last square. So worth considering. I forgot to say that if you decided on g4 in this position, that move is also good and probably, I don't know, feels close to winning for white to me as well. Something like knight b4, queen e2, knight d5, knight e4, and yeah, I mean, this knight is just terrible, and black has pretty serious problems on the dark squares. So, okay, but yeah, another lesson is closely related to this. If you decide to fianchetto really either bishop, it's usually not a good idea to move the pawn 2 squares next to it. So in this case, black played e6 and weakened all kinds of squares here. I'll highlight them so they're in the study for you guys to take a look at. But, I mean, even if you go as far back as something like this, very rarely will you see people go, let's say, like d6 in this position, because, again, it just kind of, like, weakens these squares compared to if this pawn was on d7 and these squares are covered. So weakening your king position and all that kind of stuff, and then, yeah, again, just a nice calculation exercise at the end. And kind of a funny miniature 28 moves starting after, you know, most people would not expect this many games in this position to end after 28 moves, but, you know, occasionally you get lucky and you get to rout someone. So, okay. I've babbled enough, I think, after this game. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you guys found it instructional. Let me know if you'd like to see more of my OTB games analyzed like this. This is the first one I've really done. And if you like it, I will do that. And there will certainly be more instructional videos coming your way soon, guys. Okay, bye. And oh, and by the way, shout out to John Bartholomew for the shout out. Shout out for the shout out. I got like 200 or 250 extra subscribers, which is like 25% or 30% of my subscriber base now. I really appreciate it. I hope you guys like this video. I hope all of you new subscribers kind of get a good sense about what my channel is really all about here. Usually longer time controls, the occasional sort of rigorous instructional content, usually a good bit of opening analysis in my games as well. So I hope you guys are enjoying it so far. I hope you new 250 or 200 subscribers are going through my backlog of instructional content, my Reddit opening of the week, a couple of my practical endgame series, etc. Some of my older rapid games. I hope you guys are enjoying them, and yeah, I'll be back with more. Bye, guys.